Okay, there we go. Wonderful. So again, welcome to our second class on the Wheel of Sharp Weapons. Again, most of the first class we were going through the handout that is something that was sent out to everyone. If you didn't get that, certainly let Sarah or John know. They both were having that sent out to everyone. And otherwise, you can certainly watch the video and go through that handout. But it was just giving some preliminary information on this text. Again, we also talked a little bit about the basic program. Those of you who would like to explore doing this course as a basic program course, you can let me know and I'll help you out with the materials, what have you for that. Um, so let's go back into where we were at with the text, which we didn't make it too far in, but nonetheless, we did have the title at least we talked about, and we were getting ready to go into the homage. So the first thing that I wanted to share was what I had shared last time, which was a short motivation that came from the book with commentary by Geshe Ngawang Dargye, where he says, the essence of Lojong practice is to try to bring the teachings and the mind together. If there's a gap between them, if the teachings are one thing, but our mind is in another place, the essence of the teachings is not present. So motivation is most important to make sure that this is what we're intent upon doing with these teachings. So he goes on to say then we should wish that we may apply this teaching so that we may generate bodhicitta in this life, the conventional bodhicitta, that is the root of our Mahayana path, and then attain enlightenment for all beings, driven by that mind of bodhicitta. So we should rejoice at this rare opportunity. So this was a little ways into the text that he said this, but I really liked it, and I think it's a nice thing to share every now and then. I won't share it at every class, but just to refresh that motivation and make sure that we understand that the whole purpose of going through these teachings is to apply them to ourselves and really develop our own qualities. So we looked at the title last week very briefly. It's called The Wheel of Sharp Weapons That Strikes the Enemy's Vital Point. So remember, we looked at this weapon wheel, and how it was used in the Hindu teachings with Vishnu flinging this wheel. We can see even in terms of Yamantaka here in the screen that off to the far right, there is a little wheel that's being held aloft by one of his hands. Yamantaka is a deity of highest yoga tantra. I'll be mentioning this tonight, but we are going to see some tantric references in regard to this text. This is why, again, it does, where this text came from and its origins and what have you are a little bit in question. It also has a lot of different Tibetan references that make it seem like it was actually written in Tibet, or at least originally disseminated in Tibet. So this idea again of the enemy is not the external enemy. We're not flinging this wheel to go kill everyone else that's our problem people in the world. We don't, that's not the point of this. It's to actually, have it strike at the vital point, what is keeping these two demons alive, these twin demons that we, touched on briefly in the motivation tonight. The main one being the mind of self-cherishing, which is what the Lojong teachings, these Mahayana mind training teachings, are mostly about. But they're also after the self-grasping, that subtler state of mind that is the ignorance that is keeping us bound in samsara, as well as in this unenlightened state. So that was enough on the title. Again, you can read the text as well for that. Now there is a homage. This is the overall outline of the text. There are 117 verses in this version. I think there are different versions of it. Conventional bodhicitta will be the first thing that we look at. And again, I'll point out on that outline shortly, where we stand, because there is an outline that covers the individual sections within that. And then ultimate bodhicitta, where we look at the mind of emptiness, realizing emptiness within a bodhisattva's mind that will combat the self-grasping. So conventional bodhicitta is out to target self-cherishing or self-centeredness. Ultimate bodhicitta is out to target self-grasping. And this is one of the unique traits of the Mahayana Lojong teachings, is that they usually encompass both of these, so that we do kind of a good work at combating both of those states of mind that are two demons that keep us from being enlightened. Then we dedicate the merits at the very end of it. Okay, so in the homage pays homage to Yamantaka. To the great wrathful one, Yamantaka, I pay homage. Very simply put, this is just once more a bit more of a tantric reference as opposed to a sutra reference. Yamantaka, and this is a statue of Yamantaka that's pictured there. Oftentimes it's just the paintings, the tankas that we see. But this is the highest yoga tantra deity that is used by some in their practice of highest yoga tantra. They do the practice of that deity, visualize themselves as that deity, and so on. Yamantaka is obviously a wrathful being. So there are two meanings of Yamantaka. The more definitive meaning what is that's beneath the surface, what does he represent in a sense, what is he symbolic of, is the exalted wisdom of non-dual bliss and emptiness. This too is a tantric reference, and especially a highest yoga tantric reference. Highest Yoga Tantra, as I pointed out in the previous course, is the highest of the different classes of Tantra that are practiced. Now, in Tibetan Buddhism, only the first and the fourth seem to be the ones that are practiced. And the first is called Action Tantra. The highest is Highest Yoga Tantra. And it's at that level that you actually work towards this non-dual bliss and emptiness with the subtle techniques, yogic techniques that are taught in that tantric tradition. So when we say the exalted wisdom of non-dual bliss and emptiness, we essentially mean the mind of Buddha, the mind of Yamantaka, that is together with this blissful state and the complete realization of emptiness. So it's a wisdom mind, omniscient mind that is in that state of full development. The interpretative meaning that this is what needs to be interpreted, or is a bit more provisional, is wrathful Yamantaka, who appears in the aspect of that very form and shape. So the statue that you have, on the picture there on the slide, this is referring to Yamantaka, this wrathful being that needs to be interpreted because it's not evident from this being that this is what this represents. And what is underneath the surface is that exalted wisdom of non-dual bliss and emptiness. So let's take a look at our commentary. Again, I do have a commentary that I'm going through with all of you that was written by my teacher in the master's program, Geshe Jampa Gyatso. And in his commentary on that homage, it says this line expresses worship or homage to a special object. Moreover, if he were wrathful at anything, he would be wrathful at the self-cherishing that is in the continua of sentient beings. So when we talk about him being the wrathful one, this being Yamantaka, where is his wrath directed? His wrath isn't directed again at the external enemies, because as we saw earlier in regard to this title, the real enemies are within ourselves. So the self-cherishing in particular is highlighted by my teacher. We could say that again, both of these, the mind of self-cherishing as well as the subtler mind of self-grasping, are targets of this wrathful energy of Yamantaka. There are a lot of, again, very forceful images throughout this text, this whole weapon wheel and what have you, or wheel weapon, that's just like all of these various things are very militaristic sometimes, but this is sometimes the kind of energy that we need to cut through our delusions and our crazy states of mind. So he says here then next, therefore, all bodhisattvas can be posited as being wrathful in that sense. In other words, that they are wrathful at self-cherishing. They are doing everything they can to combat that mind, to target that mind, to destroy and strike at that mind. Why? Because through their viewing self-cherishing to be the enemy, they are simply not asserted to be wrathful. That essentially, we don't call them wrathful bodhisattvas, all the bodhisattvas that exist, but they are wrathful in their own way because they have that same state of mind that's being evoked here, that is intent upon destroying the mind of self-cherishing. I think Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he did a little sadhana, he wrote a sadhana on the 8 verses of thought transformation. He said, he called it the Mahayana thought training, annihilating the demon of self-cherishing. So very forceful words that show that kind of wrath that we want to have towards it. Wrath is, again, it's usually used to refer to something that's together with anger, but here we can say it's together with compassion, especially the compassion we have for ourselves, that we know we need to fight really hard to combat these states of mind that are blocking our own welfare and blocking our ability to help others. So this is where he goes into kind of the interpretive and the final or the definitive. He says the Yamantaka in this context, the final great wrathful one, is the definitive meaning Yamantaka, the exalted wisdom of non-dual bliss and emptiness. Again, this final state of mind that is the product of all of one's practice throughout the sutra path, as well as into the tantric path, especially highest yoga tantra. The interpretative meaning, Yamantaka, what needs to be interpreted, is wrathful Yamantaka, who appears in the aspect of that very form and shape. So you have this idea of Yamantaka appearing, but what he's being interpreted as. We could say it's the same with a lot of the deities that we work with, right? Avalokiteshvara, or Chenrezig in the Tibetan, is the Buddha of compassion. He appears in various forms as 1,000 armed or 4-armed or what have you. But the definitive meaning is the great compassion of all the Buddhas that works tirelessly for their welfare. But again, that's not necessarily evident by the simple form of it, and anybody looking at it would need to know that that's how it is to be interpreted in order to really know the definitive meaning of that being who is appearing as Chenrezig or Avalokiteshvara. Now, in the Tibetan, the word for I pay homage or I prostrate is choksel. Sometimes you even might recall from different practices where it says chokselo at the end. Chokselo, it means, I prostrate to you, I pay homage to you. The syllable chak, again, that's the wily for it, which simply indicates the Tibetan characters, but it's pronounced chak. The syllable chak, literally the honorific word for hand in choksel, pay homage, refers to non-dual exalted wisdom. And the syllable tsel, literally the verb to seek, means I aspire just that. So it's kind of like I aspire to have that in my hand, to acquire that, to attain that non-dual exalted wisdom. So that is the homage. We're going to go on to the verses. Let me go ahead and read the verses in this, and maybe I'm not sure if I should go through the commentary or the slides. And sometimes it makes sense to do the slides before the commentary, sometimes after. But let's go ahead and look at each of these verses. Just as when peacocks wander in jungles of lethal poison, although there are extremely beautiful medicinal gardens, the flocks of peacocks do not delight in them, but instead are nourished by the essence of the lethal poison. Similarly, when the heroes enter the jungle of cyclic existence, although there are beautiful gardens of splendid happiness, the heroes, meaning the bodhisattvas, we should maybe say heroes and heroines and whatever other ways of indicating, all beings who are in that vein, they do not become attached to them, to the beautiful gardens of splendid happiness that exist in samsara. For these brave-minded ones thrive in the jungle of suffering. They thrive in going into the places where others don't have the ability to use them on the path, and they use them to develop their own qualities. So let me go ahead and read through the commentary, and then it'll be elucidated a little bit by the things that we share on the slides. It says, moreover, when peacocks wander in jungles of lethal poison, no matter how many medicinal gardens beautified with flowers, stems, fruit, and so on that there are, they do not delight in them. Since the splendid coloring of the peacocks' bodies is increased by the essence of the lethal poison, desiring just that, the peacocks seek it out and thrive on it. Like this, what do those who neglect themselves do? In other words, the bodhisattvas, the beings who act solely for the welfare of sentient beings, the heroes and heroines, enter the jungle of cyclic existence. So let me take it off screen for a moment, and maybe I will go back and forth to the slides. But this is based on some Indian lore around peacocks. And again, whether this is true or not, I haven't been able to find anything on the internet that confirms this. That's why this is a bit of mythology. But the idea is that peacocks, as you know, they, especially the male peacocks with all the amazing feathers that they have, that they go after this substance. It's called aconite. And aconite is said to have qualities for them that increases the luster of their feathers. The color becomes more vibrant and what have you. And so this substance, which is also called wolfsbane, I think, aconite, is dangerous for other birds. It would be poison. They would die. But the peacocks are able to go to that place where this exists, digest it, ingest it and digest it, and so that it actually becomes something that enhances their beauty. Well, we're using this analogy for bodhisattvas in terms of their lojong, their mind training. They're actually able to go to those places where normally beings would be sucked into the habitual patterns of anger, attachment, jealousy, what have you. And they're instead able to use it as a place of deepening their practice, of actually developing more qualities, which of course is what the lojong teachings are all about. It's almost a form of alchemy that we're talking about here, where you go in and you take these very base things that are a part of samsara and you transmute them into something transcendental, something that actually will increase your own qualities and, of course, your ability to help others on the basis of those qualities. So let me go through this first part that actually does talk about. Oh, I missed one little comment here. That's right, I added this in. This is back on Yamantaka, so just I can share this and then we'll get back into the peacocks. Yamantaka is a protector of the Dharma, which is why he appears in a wrathful form. He has been praised by Tsongkhapa, who says that everyone has two main enemies. Now here we're not going to be talking about the enemies of self-grasping and self-cherishing, but self-grasping is definitely there. And of course, self-cherishing is kind of behind the scenes. But the first is that self-grasping, that ignorance which destroys the mind, in which the remedy is the youthful Manjushri, carrying the sword of wisdom. So this is kind of a more sutra approach of understanding emptiness through developing that wisdom that combats our ignorance. So that's why it has the ordinary sutra form of Manjushri as an ordinary human. Well, not quite ordinary, but two arms, one face, all these sorts of things, as opposed to Yamantaka, who has many of those. And then the other sort of enemy of beings is death. Death destroys the body, of course. We have this body and then we all have to go through death, losing this body and then, acquiring another one. So the remedy for death and for the process of taking rebirth, and of course transcending all of that, is the wrathful form of Manjushri, Yamantaka. I didn't mention that earlier, but yes, Yamantaka is actually the wrathful and highest yoga tantra version of Manjushri. So that's what the Buddha of wisdom looks like, that what's on the screen there on the right, when it's manifested in this wrathful form. Something like, I think, 34 arms or 37. I can't remember all the numbers. Anyway, there's a lot, and then many faces and so on. You've got all of these different aspects that represent various things that are there to help you to overcome death, to overcome the process of rebirth by transmuting that experience into the enlightened experience. So the literal translation of Yamantaka, Yama means the Lord of Death. We often see Yama on the 12, the wheel of cyclic existence that shows the 12 links and so on. He's kind of holding the whole thing because we're all within the talons of death all the time. And so this is the what we mean by Yama in Yamantaka. And then Taka is the executioner. So the executioner of death, the destroyer of death. So that was just another little commentary from Geshe Sopa's book that I thought was worth sharing. It wasn't in Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary, but I think might be useful to have that understanding that Yamantaka is this wrathful being that's helping us to cut through the whole process of our unenlightened existence and our taking rebirth through the force of karma and delusions and what have you. So now we're getting into the verses. Again, we're in the verses on conventional bodhicitta. And actually, I should maybe show you. Oh, well, I'll just do it on the screen and then we'll go and we'll take a peek at the outline again later. Recall that if you do have the outline in front of you, there is an initial section for the outline that's called Bodhisattvas Transform Afflictions and Self-Grasping into the Path. This is the first 8 verses, actually. On your chart, it actually says 7 verses. Maybe I'll have to take it off just so I can review this with you and put that back on my PDF thing. But I'm going to show you this chart. Again, this is one of the charts that, or the handouts that you got earlier on for this course. Conventional, I showed this to you briefly last week. Conventional bodhicitta, again, is the bulk of the verses up through 102. And then we have ultimate bodhicitta taking us through 116. And then the dedication verse. This enumeration at the very beginning is according to Thupten Jinpa's translation of the text, and one of the verses gets consolidated at the beginning. So what we have as verse 8 becomes verse 7, and somewhere along the line he catches up, and I'm not really sure where that happens right now, but I will find it as we go through this. But essentially, verse 7 up here at the top should be 8. So I put in a little note there. I don't have the ability, I don't have the Acrobat document thing that will help me to allow me to change that document. But anyway, this should be 1 through 8 according to our translation, that very first outline. The next one should be number 9. So that's just verse 9 that is here on that outline, practicing removing other suffering and giving them happiness. And then this should be 10 through 48. So again, he somehow has an extra verse in 9 through 48 that we can end up with the same ending verse, but the beginning verse for our translation is 10. So this is what we're going to try to go through tonight, is these first two outlines if we can, at least the first outline, and maybe we'll go on to the second outline next week. But this is the only correction to this outline. Again, it was put together based on some preliminary information in Thupten Jinpa's translation of this text that's in the Mind Training Collection, as well as the Essential Mind Training book. All right, so let's go back to where we were at in the slides. So we're in verse 1, that's out of this part of 1 through 8. I don't need to read the verses again, 1 and 2. In this example, again, the peacocks are being lined up with the bodhisattvas. That's the first element of the analogy, is that we're saying that the bodhisattvas are like these birds that are eating the poison. The jungle that these peacocks are living in is the jungle of cyclic existence, samsara. So this is, where the peacocks all roam and partake of the poison that is there. The poison itself is the suffering and the afflictions, that exists within samsara. And of course, we can talk about suffering at a variety of levels. As we know from our teachings in the Lam Rim, the word suffering, or dukkha, as it is in Sanskrit, connotes more than just the pain that we experience. It also can connote even the happy experiences that we have, those pleasurable experiences. So we can use that larger definition to some degree, because as we're going to see, the poisons that the bodhisattva works with are not just suffering, but also happiness, also, the pleasant experiences. And we're going to start with some of that discussion, but then most of the text deals with suffering, because that's one of the main teachings in Lojong always, is how to transform suffering into the path. But this aconite, or wolfsbane, this is a picture of it, a very beautiful flower, but it's apparently, quite poisonous. So don't eat it if you see it. I don't know where it all grows. But again, whether this is really true that peacocks do this, it doesn't seem so. But it's a nice little analogy that can be used to show this process by which something that is very harmful to other beings can be ingested and used to actually make ourselves even more lustrous, more beautiful, more aligned with our practice. The medicinal gardens that would be for most beings much more tempting than the jungle and the poison and what have you, show the splendid perfections of samsaric happiness. That's again showing that we can get caught up in those happy experiences, and those happy experiences, especially when we just further our own self-cherishing and self-grasping, are only going to lead to more suffering. They aren't the way out. Even though this is said to be medicinal, it's not really medicinal at the deepest level. These are meant to be these perfections of samsara that appear like we're getting what we want, but they don't actually, come through on that promise. There are actually even 5 points of similarity between the bodhisattvas and peacocks in terms of how that is used as an analogy in this text that are cited in this book, The Wheel of Sharp Weapons, with commentary by Geshe Ngawang Dargye. Let me take a look at the chat box. I just saw there's 2 things on the chat box. Is everybody Conventional suffering and happiness. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yes. Um, so yeah, when we talk about, suffering and happiness, we're talking about them within our conventional world and our, ordinary experience that's unenlightened. For an enlightened being, they, transcend that conditioned happiness, attaining a state of bliss, and they no longer experience any pain or difficulty, anything that's conditioned in that way. All right, so these 5 points of similarity are actually in a note, a footnote, at the very end of Geshe Wandarge's commentary on the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, and I thought they were worth sharing. The first one is, just as the colors of the peacock's feathers grow more radiantly brilliant when they eat plants that are poisonous to other animals, the bodhisattvas shine with blissful happiness by making use of such poisonous delusions as desire and attachment for the benefit of others. And again, they're not actually using the desire itself and furthering it. They are using kind of, again, the the beautiful things that happen, the delightful things that we have in our lives, as a way to transmute and increase their bodhicitta, increase their desire to benefit others, wish to help others. So we're going to see that as we get into the text further. But this is the analogy at its most basic level. Secondly, just as peacocks have 5 crown feathers, bodhisattvas have the attainment of the 5 paths to enlightenment. So again, I didn't count how many were on the screen when we had the peacock there earlier, but 5 crown feathers seems to be what the text is saying. What are these 5 paths? I'm actually going to be doing a course on the paths and grounds in March for TNL on Wednesday nights, and I'll be going into these 5 paths in more detail. But they are the way that a bodhisattva progresses from when they initially develop bodhicitta in a very deep way, what we call uncontrived bodhicitta. That causes them to enter this consciousness that's called the path of accumulation, where they accumulate merit and wisdom to eventually get to the path of preparation, which is where they are preparing their minds, deepening their understanding of emptiness, so that they can overcome that self-grasping with initially the first direct realization of emptiness on the path of seeing, because they see the reality of emptiness there. They go on to further that realization, to keep removing more and more obscurations in the mind, all the way up through the subtlest obscurations, which they do on the path of meditation. At the tail end of the path of meditation, and these are where the grounds are, is on the 3rd and 4th paths, what are called the 10 grounds, or the bhumis, that the bodhisattvas go through. At the end of the path of meditation, when that bodhisattva is on the 10th ground, they go into a final meditation on emptiness, where they remove the subtlest obscurations, and they enter what's called the path of no more learning, which is the omniscient mind of a Buddha. So these 5 paths, again, I won't be talking much more about them through this course, but know that I will be doing that Wednesday course in March and April if you're curious about them. And but this is the analogy here. The 5 crown feathers of the peacock are like the 5 paths that adorn the bodhisattva. Again, the 5th one, they actually are a Buddha when they attain that. They're no longer a bodhisattva, but nonetheless, this is how Geshe Wandarge set out that kind of points of similarity. The 3rd one, just as the sight of a peacock's colorful display gives us great pleasure, the sight of a bodhisattva uplifts our mind because of their bodhicitta. That we get really inspired when we see those who have this altruistic intention for others. 4th, just as peacocks live mostly on poisonous plants and never eat insects or cause harm to others. Again, maybe that's mythology. I don't know. I have never raised peacocks or been around them to any great amount for any great amount of time, so I couldn't tell you whether they don't eat any bugs. But bodhisattvas, similarly, never cause even the slightest harm to other sentient beings. So we know that this is what bodhisattvas do for sure. Once you have developed that uncontrived bodhicitta and you've become a bodhisattva, whatever path you're on of those 5 paths, you never intentionally cause harm to others. You are always concerned about the welfare of other beings. 5th, just as peacocks eat poisonous plants with pleasure, when bodhisattvas are offered sensory objects, although they have no attachment to them, they accept them with pleasure to allow the donor to gain merit. And of course, there's other ways they can also work with those pleasurable experiences of receiving things that will be delightful for their senses. So rather than cultivating attachment towards those objects, which is what our habitual reaction is, bodhisattvas can actually use it as a means to deepen their compassion and love for other beings and so on. So just as these peacocks apparently are delighted to see like a whole bunch of wolf's bane that they can just ingest and do whatever they can to partake of it. Bodhisattvas are the same. They will happily take on these objects that would normally be objects of attachment for beings, but they are able to transmute them. Okay, so we're on to that verse. If we continue with the slides, let's go back to our text, because again, I do think there was a little bit more to cover. Were there any questions? I'm sorry, was that a question or no? Okay. All right, let's go ahead and continue with the text here. It says, psychic existence itself, due to the three poisons, attachment, hatred, and delusion, is like a dense jungle. So again, that was the point of the analogy, was that it was referring to, the jungle was referring to the jungle of cyclic existence that the bodhisattvas wander in, but again, they don't get caught up in those things in the way that we all do in terms of our reactions within samsara, within this jungle. So it says, when the heroes, the great beings, the bodhisattvas, enter it, no matter how much the splendid perfections of happiness, such as gain, respect, a good reputation, fame, and so forth, right? These are all a part of what we call the 8 worldly concerns, these things that preoccupy most of us. No matter how much all those resemble beautiful flower gardens, medicinal gardens, seeing them, they comprehend their disadvantages, the way in which they bring suffering results, and so on. So the bodhisattva has the wisdom to know that all of these objects that are so enticing in samsara are a trap, that are only going to create problems. So rather than engage in all of those, they're going to, eat the poison instead. Due to this, just as peacocks do not delight in medicinal gardens, the heroes, the bodhisattvas, do not become attached to these perfections in the slightest way, no matter how much suffering there is in cyclic existence. In the same way that peacocks enjoy lethal poison, the heroes take it as an aid to the thorough completion of the enlightened conduct. From the point of view of their willingness to accept suffering, these great, brave-minded ones thrive on it, which of course is the whole gist of this, is that we have these, bodhisattvas actually, being very delighted to see the suffering of the world and to partake of it, not to see it in others and rejoice in it. I'm talking about that they will willingly go to those places of suffering. They will happily take on that suffering. And as we're going to see in this first section, the practice of Tonglen is being introduced, and it will be used throughout the text as a means to work with that suffering as well as the happiness. So I'll get into that a little bit later tonight, probably, or at the beginning of next week's class. But know that this is, again, from the point of view of these bodhisattvas, they have no need for all of these, pleasures of psychic existence. As we saw in that slide just a few minutes ago, they happily will, if they're offered those things, they'll partake of them to allow the other person to create some merit by giving it to them. And they can even use it as a means to transform those happy experiences into deeper realizations. But nonetheless, they won't use it in the way that we all use it, which is to further our own attachment, our own desire, to simply give us more fuel for increased desire, like they say about, drinking salt water to quench your thirst. So let's go into the very next little part here that is just the first 2 lines. This is all still in that same section. Again, that's called Bodhisattvas Transform Afflictions and Self-Grasping into the Path. It says here in the verse from Dhammarakshita, because of that, those who are under the power of the cowardice that eagerly pursues happiness and pleasure spend their time in suffering. So here we can, most of us, I suppose, sign up for being included in this group under the power of our own cowardice. We simply eagerly pursue happiness and pleasure in samsara. And we end up spending our time in suffering because we only create more attachment. And when we don't get what we want, we create more energy of anger and aversion and so on. So this is how the cowards, rather than the heroic bodhisattvas, the cowards that are the ordinary sentient beings, come under the control of their afflictions. So it says there, the reason for saying because of that at the beginning is that since this is the case, because it's the case that bodhisattvas will actually go to the places of suffering and what have you, we should be seeing this. We should see that there is a problem with continuing to be a coward, with continuing to simply invest in our own suffering. So it says, if this is the case, we should willingly accept suffering. Whereas, contrary to that, due to the influence of self-cherishing, from beginningless time we have been under the power of the cowardly mind that puts effort into eagerly pursuing our happiness, pleasure, and so forth. And of course, we're not just saying self-cherishing. As we said last week, these are twin demons. And so they are often appearing together, even though, again, they don't have necessarily a cause and effect relationship between them, but they are there often together with the minds of deluded sentient beings. So it's certainly the most palpable one that we want to remove in the most of these teachings in this text is self-cherishing. But self-grasping is also kind of there below the surface. So again, this is what we've been doing since beginningless time, been under the control of this cowardice that only causes us to be concerned about our own welfare, that doesn't allow us to develop all of our abilities to, serve other sentient beings and develop ourselves to the greatest degree. It says then, due to this, we have met with nothing but suffering in the past. Essentially, this is true. I mean, because even the happiness that we've had in samsara, as we saw when we talk about the three levels of suffering or dukkha, that is unsatisfactory. In fact, the third level of suffering, the suffering of pervasive conditioning, shows that everything we've experienced 24/7 in samsara is only dukkha. We've never known a single break from this. Remember, I've quoted Rinpoche, who says there are no vacations in samsara. You never get a moment's respite. So, if we, as it says here, if even now we still do not turn away from it, we will spend our time only in suffering until the end of our future lives. So we're getting this kind of contrast between the cowardice, the way in which we kind of are under the control of that factor, and then the bravery that we need to move in the opposite direction, to become heroic. So let's look at the few things I shared in the slides for this. Again, there's the verse, the 2 lines of that. Here I shared from Geshe Sopa's commentary. He talks about cowardice, and I thought it was quite nice to hear this. Cowardice comes from our view of a real personal identity and our self-cherishing attitude. So as I said earlier, we can say they're both part of the problem, but Geshe Jampa Gyatso, my teacher, in his commentary was highlighting self-cherishing, which he tends to do throughout his commentary. Again, because this is the main thing that we initially have to target. Self-grasping has to be overcome further down the road after we've, gotten more control over our states of mind and what have you, develop more merit through being of more benefit to others and so on. So then he goes on to say, these notions make us fearful of losing what we have and not getting what we want. That false sense of a self, and then our cherishing of our dear selves to the detriment of others, make us follow that pattern of lots of fear that we're going to lose what we have, and then a lot of trepidation about not getting what we want. And this is that craving mind that is all about ourselves, that is part of this self-cherishing state of mind. He says, we are like someone sitting in the middle of a thorn bush being pricked all over by the thorns. We are always seeking protection and security, but that search only leads to suffering because we will always have reasons to be frustrated and discouraged. It's just another interesting analogy for samsara. It's like we are in a thorn bush. Sometimes we manage to get away from the thorns that seem so painful and have some break from that, but it's only a break until we are pricked again by another painful thorn. And this is the nature of our lives. As long as we're in the thorn bush, which is that pervasive condition suffering, we are going to have these experiences that are simply unsatisfactory. They never change our fundamental predicament until we address some of these deeper errors. All right, so now we go on to the next verse. Let me read it from here. I haven't been reading them from the screen so much. This is the last 2 lines of verse 3. Dharma says, while the brave-minded ones who willingly accept suffering are always happy due to the strength of their courage. So again, we saw the contrast with the previous part of the verse. Because of that, those who are under the power of the cowardice that eagerly pursues happiness and pleasure spend their time in suffering. Whereas the brave-minded ones who willingly accept suffering are always happy due to the strength of their courage. So let's take a look at what Geshe Jampa Gyatso says in terms of his commentary, so we can have a little bit deeper understanding of that. Though, again, I think most of us know, based on the things that we've been sharing already in this, the meaning of this. It says, those whose minds have become superior to that cowardice, who have transcended that cowardice, the great brave-minded ones who possess the strength of mind that willingly accepts the sufferings of all sentient beings. Remember, this is what that mind of Tonglen is all about. I will willingly take on the sufferings of all beings, and I will give them my happiness. And we're focusing on the sufferings, because again, that's where we do have to do a lot of our work. Doesn't mean we don't have to work on the happy experiences and offering them, but this is the more challenging thing, when we have sufferings pouring down on us like rain, as it's said in Lama Chopa. So these beings are very courageous, these brave-minded ones who willingly accept suffering. This is showing amazing courage, the total opposite of that cowardice. By the strength of their courage, not only in this life, but also in their entire string of future lives, they will continually go from one happiness to another. In this way, they will always be happy. So this is actually very similar. Getting down from my shelf here, a little version of the Shantideva's text, which again, all of you have studied. I did some teachings on this many years ago, and then Geshe Sherab was teaching on it, finishing last year, I believe. So there's this verse from chapter 7, that's verse 30, where Shantideva says, mounted on the horse of Bodhichitta, which puts to flight all mournful weariness, what lucid person could be in despair, proceeding in this way from joy to joy? So those bodhisattvas who embrace, willingly accept suffering and try to use it as in this alchemical way to deepen their conviction to benefit others and so on, end up having the greatest amount of joy. They just keep going from joy to joy. And of course, most beings don't see this. Even ourselves have difficulty with this sometimes, because it seems like, you really want me to do all that? You want me to take on all this suffering and be, happily going about engaging in difficult experiences? It doesn't seem like it's going to get us there. But it actually does get you there once you begin to work with it and find that this is actually the source of our awakening, is to be able to be in touch with the suffering of others and to use the suffering we have in our lives as a means of strengthening that commitment to benefit them. So again, this is what we're going to be looking at throughout the major part of this text, as I mentioned. This text doesn't go too much except in the very beginning in terms of talking about desire and happy experiences. But almost all the traditional Lojong texts have not only, again, working with the twin demons and combating them, but even within working with conventional bodhicitta as the means to overcome our self-cherishing, talks about both transforming suffering into the path as well as transforming happiness into the path. Again, I taught that one text for all of you. I'm pretty sure I did that. I don't remember anymore. It's getting to be a bit of a blur. There's so many different courses I'm teaching here and there, but there was a wonderful text on transforming our adverse conditions into the path. That was the basis for Lama Zopa's book, which is on your book list. Again, the Transforming Problems into Happiness is the name of that book. But again, we do put a lot of emphasis on transforming the problems, the difficulties, the suffering, because that's where we really do have to do the deeper work. But we also have to transform the happiness, right? Because otherwise, we just keep getting more and more attached to the pleasures of samsara. So that's, again, what we're seeing at the beginning is a little bit of a highlighting of that. But mostly what we're going to see going into it is actually working with suffering, with problems, with stuff coming into our lives. So there was only a little bit that I wanted to share in addition to what Geshe Jampa Gyatso said, which I think, again, was pretty clear. This is continuing with Geshe Sopa's commentary. He says, Bodhisattvas have a diametrically opposed attitude to these cowards. They are heroic and regard even great pain and torture as of no consequence to themselves, so long as they are working for the welfare of other living beings, voluntarily taking suffering upon themselves for the sake of others. And again, this sounds pretty outrageous, but that's how many people practice. That's how you have to practice to become a bodhisattva. This type of courage, he says, is not produced quickly or easily. It requires extensive training. Once you reach this level, you will be like the heroic bodhisattva who benefits from taking up desire, hatred, and the other poisons of psychic existence and turns them, transforms them into love and compassion, just like the peacock, which can digest poisonous plants in the jungle. So again, we've heard many of these stories that indicate this power of being able to work with a situation that's very difficult. The stories that we've all heard about these amazing practitioners in Tibet, who, when the Chinese occupation happened, and even as it continues to this day, many Tibetans are imprisoned. And there's stories. There was the one story in particular of this one man that came out of Tibet, made his way into India, came to Dharamsala to see His Holiness, had audience with His Holiness, and His Holiness asked him, tell me about some of the difficulties he had. And he said, and the man said, yes, it was extremely difficult. I couldn't believe how difficult it was while I was in prison. And His Holiness says, oh, what, they tortured you a lot? You had a lot of problems? And he said, no, it was so, he said they did, but the greatest difficulty was keeping my compassion for my captors. That we've all heard that before, but it's outrageous when you think about it. Most of us, if we were imprisoned by people and we thought we didn't deserve it at all, there was absolutely no rationale for our being in prison, and they were torturing us, and they were, starving us, and they were doing all kinds of things to hurt us, and we would be saying, "Oh, I'm really worried. I'm not going to be able to keep my compassion for these people." I mean, that sounds again totally outrageous. But that's what we have to get to with these teachings. This is what, again, these Lojong teachings are pretty high level teachings. They're based on having done the initial practice, as we're going to see coming up after the break, some of the things that are so essential as a platform for understanding how we can practice at this level. You can't just jump in at this level. It's too hard to do, too overwhelming. All right, so it's I got about a minute after. Let's call it 2 minutes after for the sake of the timing. So at 7:12, we'll reconvene, and I'll ring the little bell here from my end. So if you do wander away, just keep your speaker on, and you'll hear that. Okay, I noticed that there was in the chat box a comment about suffering, and Paimene saying, I think maybe they don't even see it as suffering, see it, perceive it, that the bodhisattvas are able to then kind of get to a place where it's not really even perceived in that negative light. And I would say that's pretty much the goal of our mind training practice. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, in his book, he often talks about how we have to learn to like problems and suffering the way that we currently like ice cream or music. We go to those things happily. And this whole idea, again, about the bodhisattvas changing their attitude towards these things, it doesn't mean that they're never going to experience another painful feeling or sensation, or that something isn't going to happen that's contrary to what would normally be good for them, in quotes. Instead, they are able to use it as something good for them, something to help deepen their qualities. So I would say there's still probably, again, painful experiences, things that are unsatisfactory from the outside looking at them, but the internal experience for the bodhisattva is very different. They're just delighted, happy when these things happen. Back on that first verse, I'm sorry, second verse, the second verse where it started off with the line of, similarly, when the heroes enter the jungle of cyclic existence, although there are beautiful gardens of splendid happiness, the heroes do not become attached to them. For these brave-minded ones thrive in the jungle of suffering. The idea here is that, again, bodhisattvas happily take rebirth again and again in samsara. That's the bodhisattva vow, the commitment we make, right? When Master Shantideva has that wonderful verse, for as long as space exists, as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too abide to dispel the miseries of the world. This is what the bodhisattva is intent upon doing. So it's like they're happily entering back into psychic existence again and again and again, and making good use of what they find there, rather than, again, getting caught up in the habitual reactions that the cowardly do, do. And they have that deep courage to be able to face those situations, to transform them, to be like that Tibetan in the prison, and being tortured by his captors, and only having one thing on his mind: how do I keep my compassion for them? How do I make sure I keep being devoted and dedicated to developing myself for them? I mean, even if we look at, I can't help but think about some of what's going on with the impeachment trial and what have you that's occurring right now. It's very hard when you see some of these people who are doing things that are so outrageous, so driven by anger and whatever. No matter what side of the fence you're on, it's very difficult to watch that and to really feel compassion for those people. But if we really get what's going on for them, that's the only logical response, right? Hatred simply doesn't make sense, and it doesn't get you anywhere. It shuts them out of your heart and your concern, and that only damages yourself as well. They won't be the object of your compassion and concern, but moreover, you're going to be limited then in your ability to really work for the welfare of all beings, and therefore develop your mind to the state of Buddhahood. So bodhisattvas see this. It's all very logical for them, and they moreover have that conviction, that desire to move in that direction. So anyway, I just thought I would point that out. I do think that, yeah, at some point, maybe they don't see it as suffering, or they certainly don't experience it in the way that we do as suffering. They actually are delighted when this is happening. Oh, good, I have a problem today. I'm, so happy that my neighbor is really irritating me with whatever they're doing, or, because I get to work on this, I get to do this stuff. This, once more, is one of the most core teachings of the Lojong Mahayana mind training, is to transform those difficult things into rich opportunities. I use the word alchemy, but it's even another sort of really basic thing that we see in our world is what happens with manure, right? You take the manure of animals and you can make it into fertilizer, right? It's actually from the crap that things grow, and it's very much true for us too, right? The crap in our lives is actually the most important opportunity for us to grow. In fact, I don't think if we really can grow if all we get is flowers, and everything's delicious and delightful. We're never going to be, moving in a more constructive direction unless we are confronting those things that are going against the grain of what we want, or, challenging us in some way. Because that's when we really develop ourselves a bit more, push the envelope, keep moving. So that's kind of the gist of these teachings, is to help us to do that. So let's go back to the text, my teacher's commentary. We have verse 4. Oops, that's the problem with these PDF files. You go a little too far and then they jump to the next page. At the bottom of this page, 2, is verse 4. Presently, attachment is like a jungle of lethal poison. It is overcome by the peacock-like heroes, but takes the life of the crow-like cowards. So the peacock-like heroes, the bodhisattvas, can overcome it. They can actually use that. It doesn't mean, again, that it changes what it is. You're still going to have those experiences, like I was just saying, but they're able to transmute it, to work with it, to deepen their qualities, to enhance everything that they're trying to become. Just like the peacock has more beautiful, radiant feathers on the basis of that poison. But it takes the life of the crow-like cowards, those cowards that we were just describing. So let's look at what Geshe-la says on this. Presently, that is, on this occasion of training the mind in the path of great beings, this is the third of the 3 paths of the Lam Rim that we are, again, firmly rooted in here in regard to these teachings. Boundless attachment, like a jungle of lethal poison, is very abundant. I mean, look at the world we live in. We're just getting, the human perspective on it. We see animals to some degree with our pets and what have you, but it's no different in the animal world. It's no different in all the realms of samsara, essentially. It's just very, obvious in this human world how deeply beings are driven by attachment in this jungle of lethal poison. And they only increase their own suffering again by just continuing to do the same thing again and again and expecting different results. It never satisfies. Lama Zopa always quotes, he always says that Rolling Stone song, um, can't get no satisfaction. So that song is very much about what the experience is for most beings in samsara. You never really get satisfaction. You never really find that thing that, oh, now it's complete. Now I don't have to look anymore. I don't have to search anymore. It doesn't exist in samsara. So he goes on to say that too is overcome by the peacock-like great heroes. That is, they are able to carry it into the path. Whereas if the crow-like cowards experience it, in addition to their not being able to carry it into the path, it also counteracts the path to liberation. In other words, it just keeps them bound up in creating more and more of the causes of suffering. So not only do they can't make it into something positive, but moreover, it becomes something very detrimental. So he uses the example here. If peacocks eat even lethal poison, they will certainly overcome it. While if for that reason crows eat it, thinking that it's good for them, unlike the peacocks, they will die. Why? Because they don't have the courage and the conviction and the state of mind that a bodhisattva brings to it. And then the last little statement here before we go on to the next verse is what I was mentioning earlier, is that this is high level stuff. This is the path of great beings. This is the third level of the Lamrim, stages of the path. Those who have not previously trained their minds in the paths of small and middling beings are not able to carry attachment into the path, simply put. Don't expect that we can practice without having trained our minds in the initial teachings of the Buddha that lead us to, in the small scope, have concern about our future existence, to be concerned about creating positive karma so that we don't have to end up in an unfortunate state, so we can continue our spiritual development. That's the small scope. And then in the middle scope, to see the big picture that each of us is caught up in, and to develop that personal compassion, that self-compassion that is intent upon being free from that. This is what we call the mind of renunciation. Those are what the first two are about. And if we don't really get those clearly for ourselves, then we don't have the ability to practice at this high level that the bodhisattvas practice at. So again, it doesn't mean we have to have perfect realizations of everything, below the great scope, but we have to have a good working understanding of it and already be moving in that direction. If we're going to be talking about, again, how do bodhisattvas deal with the afflictions and with the things that draw one into the afflictions? There are many different ways of working with these. The very basic level at the beginning of our path is to do everything we can not to get caught up in those states of mind. We see them as, absolute poison. And so it's very important in our development to begin to frame it in that context, to always throughout the path hold that attachment, anger, and so on, and all the things that draw us into that are problematic. And even at the higher levels that we're talking about tonight and then this text, there still is that view, but there's a recognition that you can do some deeper work with those things. So the very first way that we begin to work with the delusions is often even what I call your first line of defense, which is get away from the things that cause you to have those delusions triggered until you can develop some strength of mind to be able to be with them and not be triggered. And that's where we start moving up into the deeper levels of practice on the middle scope and what have you, where we start to learn to work with our minds so that we can be around those experiences and keep our mind in a very firm place and not allow attachment and so on to arise. At the great scope, the level of the bodhisattva, then you almost want to be around those things because you want to further your ability to be a benefit to others. You see that this is what the whole, again, Lojong approach is about, is to help us to combat the things in our own minds that keep us from benefiting others, and to help us to connect with and stay connected with the suffering of others and their predicament. Those on the Hinayana path that are intent on their own liberation, right? Whereas the Mahayanas, they want to stay engaged in the world. They want to keep in touch with the suffering of other beings. They want to know what that's like. They want to be there experiencing that with them. They want to develop this strong wish to free them from that because that's their path. Their path is to go beyond their own self-concern, which is the subtlest way, again, that self-cherishing works. Remember, we looked at that last week, how self-cherishing is grosser in most of its manifestations with most beings. But at the subtlest level, it's what keeps you from entering into the path that leads to enlightenment, the Mahayana. It's what keeps you in a path of just achieving your own liberation. But, again, most beings aren't even at that level. Most beings are simply caught up in the play of karma and delusions and continuing to create their own suffering. So when we finally enter the Bodhisattva path, we have to learn to practice with the delusions in different ways and the situations that would lead us into delusions in different ways. Tantra, which is an extension of the Mahayana, the Great Scope, is where you learn to work with the delusions in even more profound ways. But you can't be at that level without having practiced the other things that get you there. Just like you can't be at the Mahayana way, the Great Scope way, without having done the middle scope and the lower scope. So it's all, built upon the foundation that comes before it. We can't expect that we can jump in at the top and have perfect success in how we're working with things. So let's go to the screen here. I found a nice little photo of a crow. The crows are the cowardly beings in this analogy. The crows are other birds who eat of the poison, who think, oh, this sounds like a good way to work, and then they only die by virtue of it. They only cause their own suffering. Why? Because they're cowardly. They don't have the conviction, the courageous mind of a bodhisattva that is intent upon transmuting that experience into something beneficial. Whoops, somehow it keeps clicking twice. There is a Tibetan proverb, apparently, according to Geshe Sopa, that says, the poison that nourishes the peacock brings ruin to all others. And he says that closely echoes these opening verses of the wheel weapon, that this is a rare being, that can transmute all of those things that normally bring ruin to all other beings into something that is nourishing, that actually helps one to grow and develop. He continues, he says, unless one has trained one's mind in the initial and medium levels of motivation, one will never achieve Mahayana thought and cannot take suffering and so forth as a path. Again, what I just said and what Geshe Jampa Gyatso said in his commentary, we need to train in the lower levels of the path before we can get to the great level. Only the brave bodhisattvas who have already undergone these trainings can take suffering as a path. So if you've trained your mind well in the lower scope, in the middle scope, then you are ready to practice at the great scope level, ready to work at that, peacock level. So otherwise we're going to be like cowardly crows and only be consumed by the poison that we try to use in the path. The jungle, and this is from Geshe Choni, the jungle here is a metaphor for attachment or desire. And this is kind of an interesting point. As I was mentioning earlier, it's not throughout the whole text that we really talk about attachment or desire. It's presented here, though, showing that this is kind of the default mode that we have. As you've all heard before, maybe I'll take it off screen here so I'm not talking so much while you're reading words or what have you, but as you've all heard before, probably from Venerable Rabina or me or other teachers, attachment is that way that we are always kind of going about trying to get what we want. But what happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants? That's when we have aversion, anger, all the frustrating things that we experience, right? That's our default mode, though, right? And I love how Venerable Rabina puts it. I use it frequently because I think it's so true, that we're like junkies born into a world of junk. And this is how we go about our lives, like, junkies or vampires or something. We're just continually wanting to satisfy our desire for something that brings us happiness. And we spend all our time trying to do that. And any time that something takes us off track, we just immediately have the angry response towards that because it's not giving us what we want. But even when we get what we want, it doesn't satisfy. It just keeps us in junkie mode. We need the next fix and we need the next fix and then the next fix, and we never get the final fix. In samsara, there is no final fix. We simply keep craving. So this is, again, the problem that we're facing in regard to this. And even when we're talking about desire and attachment at the beginning, the implication is that we're also talking about suffering and not getting what we want, because that's inevitably going to happen when we keep moving from a place of desire, that being our motivation. So Geshe Choni, by the way, Geshe Choni is, I met him when I was leading the November course at Kopan in 2015. He is the uh, abbot of Kopan Monastery. He's there about 6 months of the year, and then the rest of the time he's in Singapore. I don't know. I think he's been just at Kopan with the pandemic, though, obviously, because they're not doing teachings at the center in Singapore in person. So maybe he's doing them online. I don't really know, but really wonderful Geshe. He says desire is specifically singled out here because it is something that arises very easily in our mental continua. And even when it arises, it is very difficult for us to identify and know that it has arisen. As I said, this is like our most, like our programming, our default mode where we are just continually generating that desire. And again, self-cherishing is often together with that because we are mostly thinking about me and what I need to satisfy my desire. And of course, the root of it, the self-grasping mind, is obviously there in any of the delusions. That self-grasping is present without a doubt because everything's revolving around this fictitious self that we are trying to satisfy. So again, this is, I just wanted to share his words because I think they're really totally spot on. Goes on to say, the heroes or bodhisattvas are able to utilize desire as a method to benefit other sentient beings, but ordinary beings are unable to do this. Why is there this difference in the ability to use and transform desire? The bodhisattvas are able to employ desire to benefit others because they have no self-cherishing whatsoever, or their self-cherishing is very minimal. They've developed their mind into that uncontrived bodhicitta. That's what makes you a bodhisattva. So they've already combated their self-cherishing to a very large degree, much more than we have, certainly than I have. So it says, for ordinary beings like us, however, until we overcome our self-cherishing, there is no way that we can transform any of the mental poisons into an aid to accomplish something beneficial. Again, now this might start sounding like, well, then I have to overcome my self-cherishing in order to engage in the techniques to overcome my self-cherishing. I don't think that's what he's necessarily saying. It's not making it into a kind of a self-negating thing. Just saying that we all do need to see that at least that it is the goal to overcome our self-cherishing. Again, most beings in the world don't even think about overcoming their self-cherishing. They think it's just the way things are. So anyway, I won't share too much more on that because I do want to keep moving through the verses that I'd like to get through tonight. A little bit more on this idea of the training in the three aspirations of the stages of the path. This is Venerable Thupten Chodron's book on this text, Good Karma. It's on your book list. So without training in all those and their corresponding practices, she says, it's important to be vigilant regarding our interactions with objects of attachment. So until we've actually trained our minds, it is important that we take some caution around those. That's why I said the initial line of defense is stop being around the things that draw you in and make you totally crazed with attachment. Just like an alcoholic or someone who is involved with substance abuse, the first step is to get it out of your house, stay away from it. Don't go around the people who are using or drinking because that's going to be the most dangerous thing for you. She says, this is not because those objects or people are bad, but because we are not yet skilled in restraining our attachment and maintaining a balanced state of mind when we're around them. So oftentimes that's the first line of defense. Bodhisattva practitioners on the higher levels of the path, though, can enjoy objects of attachment. Why? Because they know the pleasure is deceptive, it is impermanent, and lacks inherent existence. They've already trained their minds in those realizations that precede their entering into the Mahayana, into the Bodhisattva's path. Due to their wisdom, they do not become entangled in attachment. They see, oh, here's these objects. These are objects that will induce pleasure, but that's all that they see them as. They don't see them as what will further my grasping and continue to keep me bound up in that cycle of junkyism. So instead, well-trained tantric practitioners are able to generate the blissful wisdom that realizes emptiness by enjoying those pleasures. So as I said, at the highest level, those who practice tantra actually enjoy those pleasures and generate blissful wisdom, which isn't together with attachment, but it's the same objects that would induce attachment in ordinary beings. These bodhisattvas actually cultivate a wisdom that will help develop their minds all the way to enlightenment. And then, of course, the conclusion, however, if those of us whose minds are overwhelmed with attachments surround ourselves with objects of attachment, we get sucked in by them and create more causes of suffering, trying to procure them and then to protect them. All that energy that goes into that. Again, I'm imagining that most of us have simplified our lives to some degree. Whoops. So that maybe we're not kind of totally caught up in these things. But we can still see these patterns playing out to some degree, and some may see it in coarser ways than others. But recognize that's what we're trying to overcome, and we have to keep moving in that direction. Sometimes going cold turkey is good for some people. Like, I'm just going to stop. I won't do that ever again. And that may be good for some of you, but recognize that some of you may simply need to keep moving, gradually on this path. That's probably the more preferable path, because sometimes going cold turkey doesn't work. I mean, look at people who deal with cigarette smoking. I smoked for about 5, 6 years when I was in college and just after, in my 20s and what have you. And I didn't really find it too hard to smoke or to quit smoking, but nonetheless, I know a lot of people who really struggle with it. There's even somebody I know in New Mexico who had one lung removed because of the cancer that was there, and kept smoking even with the other lung remaining. It was had such a hold on her. So we can see that, again, if we're not careful with this, if we just keep allowing things to come in and we don't do anything to control that, we're going to have problems, because the attachment's never going to be in check. We might delude ourselves in thinking, oh no, I can still keep having all these things, but I don't have any attachment. There's no attachment involved. Well, why do you keep obtaining more and procuring more and holding on to them and protecting them and all the things that are involved? So again, I think we have to be honest with ourselves on these things and not think, oh, again, I can practice like a tantric practitioner and have all this blissful wisdom energy every time I listen to this beautiful piece of music or eat this delicious dessert or whatever the case might be. I'm teaching as much to myself as I am to you with this. Trust me, we all still deal with all of this. So there's a question from Divya. If one tends to self-criticism and blaming one's own self for wrong things that happen in this life, this would also fall under self-cherishing category. Yes, I think you're right with that, Divya. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when he had a meeting with Western teachers of Buddhism many years ago. Venerable Thupten Chodron was there, who I mentioned earlier. Sharon Salzberg was there, who's another teacher of Buddhism. And she actually asked this question of His Holiness, as I recall, and the accounts I've heard of it. I wasn't there because I wasn't even in the Dharma at that time. But His Holiness was asked this question about the mind that criticizes ourselves, blames ourselves, what in the West we call our self-hatred or self-loathing. And His Holiness was shocked to hear this. He goes, what do you mean that sentient beings, or people that are doing this, hating themselves? He says, we cherish ourselves. And when he asked him, first of all, how many of you have experienced this yourself, not just with students that you work with? And everybody's raising their hand. We all kind of grow up with a lot of that self-directed negative thinking, right? And then when His Holiness got them to speak about it a bit more, he began to understand, just as you're pointing out, Divya, that the self-cherishing mind is what's underneath all of that. Because that, once more, is we focus on ourselves and we are thinking about ourselves most, and that causes a preoccupation with ourselves that doesn't allow us to think about others. That's why they often say some of the best ways to get out of that sort of caving in on ourselves in negative ways, or depression, even things like that, is to work with others, help others, be around people whose situation moves you to want to get out of your own stuff. Again, I'm not saying that's a universal sort of thing that should be prescribed for everyone. There are people who probably need some good Western therapy and maybe even intervention with medications and what have you to help them. But the Buddhist answer is to really get out of that self-centered thing, where this is where we're working from, is this place of ourselves that we're either elevating and wanting to please that self, or we're deprecating and putting it down and thinking, the worst of ourselves. It's the same thought pattern in terms of what we're grasping at or holding to, the self-centeredness. It's just different directions. One is kind of elevating ourselves up. The other is moving ourselves to the bottom of the pile and thinking the worst of ourselves. So this is what we're trying to combat, this primary enemy that's being directed, all this energy is being directed towards. Let's carry on with verse 5. Dhammarakshita says, how can the selfish overcome this poison? If they are also similarly involved in the other afflictions, these afflictions will cost the crow-like their life. So again, if we are continuing to be selfish, self-centered, we're never going to be, able to overcome these, to use this poison on the path, because we're only going to be involved in the afflictions. So Geshe-la says, also, for the poison of attachment and so forth to become a method for accomplishing others' welfare, it is necessary to completely eliminate the snare of selfishness. So again, that's very similar to what Geshe Choni was saying, right? That we do have to overcome that self-centeredness in order to be able to do this. But recall that doing this is the method also for overcoming that selfishness. So as I was saying, it is important that we at least have the motivation in that direction. We see it for what it is. We see that the self-cherishing is the enemy that we want to strike at and remove. And we do what we can then on the basis of our understanding from having cultivated the lower realizations of the stages of the path, that we then can courageously roll up our sleeves and do this deeper work. Geshe-la continues, he says, since those who desire their own happiness, those who are under the control of that self-cherishing, are not able to do so, they will not overcome this poison, and will also be similarly involved in the other afflictions, such as hatred, delusion, miserliness, jealousy, and so forth. So again, it's not like that's the only one you have to deal with, is your own attachment and desire. Desire leads to hatred, as we explained earlier, when we don't get what we want. And the delusion that's at the root of all of it, the ignorance that just continues to be furthered because we're not doing anything to counteract it. The miserliness, that it's the heightened form of attachment where we grasp onto what we have and don't want to let it go. And our jealousy, our anger at others having, greater things than we have, whether it be qualities or possessions or status or what have you. And it says, while the heroes are able to transform these afflictions into a method for accomplishing the path, if the crow-like cowards, and even he includes in here those who are on the Hinayana path, the hearers, the solitary realizers, these are the two practitioners of Hinayana paths that lead to self-liberation. Even if they indulge in them, in addition to their not being able to transform them into such a method, the afflictions, as mentioned above, will also cost these people the life of liberation. That is, they will cut its life vein. So again, it's just saying again that these practices are really for somebody who has trained themselves to begin to look at self-cherishing as a problem. The hearers and the solitary realizers have not yet address their subtle self-cherishing. Remember, that's what I was talking about last week and what I even talked about a little bit earlier tonight. So what it's saying is that because they haven't begun to see self-cherishing, self-centeredness as a problem, they may be able, and you can still practice your path that leads to your own liberation by overcoming self-grasping, but you will still be under the control of some subtle level of self-cherishing. You won't be able to really practice the way that the bodhisattvas practice because you haven't seen that as an obstacle yet. You know, it isn't again, as we saw in His Holiness's words last week, it isn't a delusion. The self-centeredness isn't a delusion. It can be together with delusions, but in and of itself, it's not a delusion because the hearers and solitary realizers, those on the Hinayana path, do attain their own liberation, a very virtuous result, by staying focused on their own welfare and wanting to be free of their own self-grasping and all the other afflictions. But they can't practice like the bodhisattvas. They are still crows. They are still cowardly when it comes to this analogy. Why? Because they have not yet seen that the self-cherishing that keeps them only looking at their own liberation is a problem. I just think it's perfectly fine. As long as I get out of here, bye everyone. Let's hope it works out for you. See you on the other side. They don't really have that concern that a bodhisattva does of, I need to take on, doing what I can to achieve the welfare of all these beings. I need to hold them as most dear. I need to elevate my cherishing others and completely get rid of my self-cherishing. So again, this is the point of this. So let's go to, I don't know if I had any other slides to share on this. I've got to keep better track of all this. Yeah, I do have a little bit. There's a Geshe Venerable Samlo Geshe Khalsang who is he was at Langri Tangpa Center, I believe it was. No, it's a Losang Drakpa Center in Malaysia, I think is his commentary. It says, for the sutra path, the mental afflictions are used to assist the bodhisattva on the path as a limb or a branch, but for the tantric path, the defilements are being used as the path. Oh, I know what this is referring to. I'm getting you confused a little bit because I didn't share that little bit at the end of this. That's the problem. Let me go back to the commentary. Okay, that's the problem. All right, so we have this one little kind of quizzical sentence that's in there just at the end, after the commentary that he gave on verse 5 and before getting into verse 6. Geshe-la says, there is a difference between the two. One, being transformed into a method for accomplishing others' welfare, and two, being carried into the path. So let me kind of talk about this first a little bit before we go back to the slides. When we talk about this distinction between these two ways of working with the afflictions, or again, with what will draw us into those afflictions, all these desirable things of samsara, the jungle of cyclic existence, what we're talking about is two different ways that we can work with it. At the great scope level of the sutra path, where the bodhisattva is trying to work with mostly this is what the teachings we're talking about here. Again, there are occasional tantric references, but we're not really talking about how to transform everything tantrically yet. And we won't even get into that as part of this text. That's a higher level teaching. But at this level, we are talking about, again, what was said there, being transformed into a method for accomplishing others' welfare. That means we're going to use what we're meeting in all these situations, whether it be something that would cause us to generally have attachment, or something that causes generally to have anger and aversion, as an assistant on our path, something to assist us in developing our deeper commitment towards others, enhancing our bodhicitta by, again, keeping us in touch with the suffering of others, keeping us aware of how we have to be vigilant and not being drawn into those same habitual patterns because we want to be a benefit to all beings. All these different mindsets that we're going to be looking at as we go through this text. All of this is the sutra way of kind of working with transforming these things into a path, ingesting the poison and transmuting it into something that becomes more beautiful for you as a bodhisattva. The second one that was mentioned on the text when I just shared it, being carried into the path. This is actually unique teachings to Tantra. This is found only in those teachings where the way that I like to talk about it, and you can read Lama Yeshe's Introduction to Tantra. It's available for anyone to read. You don't have to have had any tantric empowerment to read it. But essentially, it's the idea of using the energy of these delusions, especially attachment. When we have strong things that entice us, that give us this kind of energy that is about, oh, I want that, the thought of I want that is misdirected, but the energy can be utilized. Tantra is all about subtle energies and using those subtle energies in very profound ways through yogic practices to induce this union of bliss and emptiness, this wisdom mind that is realizing emptiness and cultivating this blissful state. So again, that's about all I'm going to say about Tantra. And there might be a few other points again where I touch on a tantric point or two, but essentially that's not what this is all talking about. That's why Geshe Jampa Gyatso put into his commentary that there's a big difference between these. As I said, there's a big difference between our initial way of working with objects of attachment, and then at the middle scope, and then at the great scope, and then at the tantric path. And every one of these shows a gradual development of our minds in terms of our capability to be able to work with these things. But he's already pointing out that we're not talking about the tantric methods for utilizing attachment energy and so on. Those are taught in Tantra, and this, again, text does have some tantric allusions, but it's not a tantric text per se. It's not teaching us how to practice in that way. So I don't know if there was much more. Oh, there was that slide again. Let's go back to that now. I started reading this and then realized it was on that additional point that I forgot to read in the commentary. So for the sutra path, again, the mental afflictions are used to assist the bodhisattva on the path as a limb or a branch. But for the tantric path, the defilements are being used as the path. Again, not that we further our attachment, but we recognize when attachment's arising and utilize the energy of attachment. Or you can even utilize the energy of anger. That's what a lot of these wrathful beings are about, right? You don't have this mean, ferocious looking dude, like Yamantaka, without it being connected to that type of energy, that sort of anger energy, but is going to be turned back in on itself as a means of conquering our anger. We're going to use the energy of anger. They often use the analogy of insects that are born from the wood that actually consume the wood in the process of their development. So we are going to be developed from the wood of our afflictions, but we're going to consume the afflictions in the way of actually coming into being as a Buddha. I guess they're referring to termites there. At least that was the conclusion we had at the master's program. He goes on to say, that one way we can talk about using attachment on the path is an example that's often set out in the sutras. A king who had 1,000 sons, those who have the strong imprint became his sons and could attain Buddhahood faster. So if you have a bodhisattva king who is born and wants to create like a whole retinue of children that will then follow in his footsteps and he'll be able to help them all, well, then that may be one way of doing it. So that does take some utilization of desire on the path, to procreate and what have you, and to, produce heirs that are, or heiresses, it just says sons here, but we would say any offspring could then be under the guidance and the influence of a bodhisattva king. And he says this example is from the Sutra Path, but it's just one example. Again, what we're going to be talking about, and we're not going to, again, go into attachment quite so much. It's only in this introductory section where we really talk about transforming attachment. But we can use attachment in a variety of other ways, especially in the practice of Tonglen, when we see all those delicious, delightful things that come into our lives. Instead of generating attachment for them, generate the mind that lets go of them, that offers them, that wants others to have them. This is coming up in one of the verses, verse 8 and 9 is where we start looking at Tonglen. Whoops. So the next verse, the first 3 lines, because of this, the peacock-like brave-minded ones combine the afflictions, which are like a jungle of poison, into an elixir, and enter the jungle of psychic existence. Again, happily take rebirth in psychic existence, knowing that this is the stuff from which we can develop our hearts and minds to this greater degree. So it just shows, again, the amazing courage and fortitude of the bodhisattvas to do this. Let's go to, I hate to be always toggling back and forth between these two. I suppose I don't need to show the commentary in some ways, but maybe it helps to have it on the screen. But hopefully all of you have that printed out in front of you and can make notes on it or what have you. So Geshe-la, in his commentary on what I just read, says, for this reason, the great peacock-like brave-minded ones combine the very strong and abundant afflictions, which are like a jungle of lethal poison, into an elixir. Again, this alchemical reference, which is also very common in the mind training teachings, and enter the jungle of psychic existence, which is transformed into a method for accomplishing others' welfare. So again, very much unlike those in the hearer path and the solitary realizer path, they look forward to coming back into samsara to keep developing their qualities and their wish to benefit others, so they can eventually become a Buddha. Similar to that verse from Shantideva that I mentioned earlier about for as long as space exists and so on. The Bodhisattva's attitude is one of always wanting to continue to engage in whatever will help them to further their development so they can eventually become a Buddha, accomplish the welfare of others. That's the main goal of bodhicitta. The secondary goal is to become enlightened to do that. But we have to keep, wanting to accomplish others' welfare, wanting to, help them to the greatest degree. And he goes on to say, moreover, the way in which they combine them into an elixir is, if illustrated with respect to attachment, that when they have a perfect dwelling place, a home, and maybe many of you have what you consider to be your perfect home right now, your perfect place that you go to and feel very safe and secure and nurtured by, and it gives you everything that you need. And due to enjoying it, generate attachment to living there. At that time, through thinking about this, they do not come under the power of this bad mind. So this is just pointing into a much easier example, perhaps for us to relate to, rather than procreating and having, 100 offspring that can become bodhisattvas under us. Rather, the idea is here is even when you have something that you are experiencing that would normally cause attachment to arise, at that time, You see the object for what it is and the potential for you to generate a different state of mind, a mind that is opposed to attachment, and could even once more dedicate what you are doing with utilizing that perfect dwelling place into a means to benefit others. So let's look at what Geshe Wandarge says about this. I found an example very similar in his text, his commentary. He says, as an example of our own situation, if we have a beautiful house to live in and we have attachment to it, we should think in the following way. Until today, completely influenced by such vulgar thoughts as attachment, I have been wandering in cyclic existence. From now on, I should use this house only as a tool to help me to attain enlightenment for the welfare of all beings. We should think similarly about food, that it is to be eaten to benefit others. So if you have something wonderful and delightful in your house or in your life, such as your house, your abode, then think, how wonderful that I have this. I need to make good use of this. Rather than thinking, oh, I really don't want to leave this. I really like this. I don't want to die and be separated from this beautiful, place that I'm dwelling in. There's more comments on the similar vein from Geshe Sopa in his commentary. He says, when the Bodhisattva does these things with the motivation of serving other sentient beings, then every action becomes a noble one. Eating a mouthful of food, sleeping, and other things that are done to care for the body become virtuous actions. The Bodhisattva motivation turns even small daily tasks into noble activities. Remember, we went through this, I touched on it a little bit in the last course, not with great instruction, but mentioning it, that Rinpoche has this whole little booklet about Bodhichitta Mindfulness, turning your sitting on the toilet into a virtuous activity, or your turning on a light in a room into a virtuous activity, because you're generating bodhicitta together with it. This is what the bodhisattvas do with all these things that are normally either neutral activities or activities that would draw us into more attachment, such as eating food and what have you. We want to make them into virtuous activities by bringing our awareness of utilizing what is happening for us, to us, for the benefit of all sentient beings. The next little line, that's just the last line of verse 6, says, while willingly accepting them, they should destroy the poison. So while willingly accepting, all of the sufferings and things that happen, they should destroy the poison, I'm sorry, accepting them means here accepting all these wonderful things. While willingly accepting all the things that come into our lives that we would normally have attachment for, we should destroy the poison of attachment. We should be rid of the poison of attachment, practicing in the way that we just saw from Geshe Sopa and from Geshe Ngawang Dargye. Okay, let me just share a little bit more, and then we will probably have to call it a night. I was hoping to get a little bit further, but, we'll make it. Whoops, there we go again with this PDF thing. Geshe-la's commentary on that line says, also, when they utilize desirable objects and so forth for the welfare of others, while lacking selfishness, conceit, and so on, internally they should have the fear that comprehends their disadvantages and so forth, that these things will draw us into unhealthy patterns that will block our attainment of enlightenment for the benefit of others. And externally, when offered desirable objects, as we saw earlier, they should willingly accept them as though delighting in them in order for others to complete the collection of merit. So if you're offered things by somebody, it's really good advice to accept that because you are completing their merit of giving. If you don't accept it, then you are blocking them from gaining the merit of being generous. It says if they do this by the force of contemplating their disadvantages, not only will the desirable objects and so forth not be able to harm them, but also the potency of the afflictions will be destroyed. Hence, it is mentioned in this way. So the idea here is that when you do have those delicious, delightful things in your life and somebody's offering them to you or whatever, you transmute it. You make it into a more positive experience. You recall the disadvantages of the grasping, junky mind and be with those experiences without that, and with the positive mind of bodhicitta, as we saw. And if someone offers you those things, you gladly accept it because you see that you also want to be involved in creating the causes of happiness for others. And generosity is one way that beings create the causes of their future happiness, albeit temporal happiness initially. It can become ultimate happiness if practiced, in greater and greater levels, eventually with bodhicitta and so on. So yes, this is kind of the way bodhisattvas, as we're seeing, as I said earlier, this is in this beginning part, mostly looking at how they deal with desire and objects of attachment. We're going to get more advice as we go deeper into the text. And of course, from verses 10 through 48 is where we get into a repetition of all the various things that are different experiences of suffering that are undesirable objects. And how do we work with those? And that will be, again, advancing some of the Lojong techniques of doing that. But in regard to the pleasurable things, there are Lojong techniques as well. As I said earlier, almost every Lojong text has both of those in it. Rinpoche's book worked with the one text that, again, I did teach on, I think, for all of you. I think I taught that. Maybe I didn't. I don't know. It was a text that, again, is the root text that Rinpoche is teaching on in that book, but he dwells mostly on the suffering experiences, not so much on the experiences of happiness. But the experiences of happiness are also means for us to develop renunciation, right? Because when we see all those things coming in, we go, this is a trap. I know that this is going to imprison me more if I continue to keep getting sucked into all these things. So we develop a deeper commitment for our own personal desire to be free of this. That's renunciation. And then we also see that through our own experience of this, we can develop a desire to remove the afflictions of others, to remove all of their suffering, which is, again, what we're practicing in this, primarily in this Mahayana vein. But we can use whatever we're experiencing, whether it be good, bad, indifferent, as a means of awakening, a means of kind of moving further on the path to enlightenment. All right, so we will continue with the text. We've got lots of time, I think, but nonetheless, some of these verses, when we get into like 10 through 48, we might not spend as much time on some of them because they do get a little bit repetitive. The pattern of them is even identical from verse to verse, but it is important that we do touch on a number of them so that we gain an appreciation for that side of this text. That's why Venerable Thupten Chodron, she called her book Good Karma, How to Create the Causes of Happiness and Avoid the Causes of Suffering, because that's the main teaching we're going to use in that section. Not completely, because we're also going to do Tonglen within that, but the idea is to really get this teaching of karma to hit home in a really major way. So any final questions or comments on what we've talked about tonight? Anybody? Now, what I would encourage you to do, again, I was going to send some meditations here and there. Maybe I will even send one to John with tonight's slides to begin to work with sort of self-cherishing and what have you. But you can certainly reflect on these verses. These verses, I always like to encourage people when I'm teaching texts like this that have verses to use the verses as meditation tools, to just simply sit with them and read them through. And like even that analogy, and that's in the first two verses, to aspire to be like that, to kind of move away from our, aversion to poison, to the things that would be problematic for us, and to be drawn to those things because we see that they're actually a way to cultivate deeper qualities. I mean, that's a big part of this process, is just the willingness to go there. Yes, Eloise, or Adrian, yes.
So hi.
Hi.
I, I understand what you are saying about being that we should develop being drawn to those things which we might normally have an aversion to use as a path.
Right.
Um, but I also, when you were first talking about it, I was thinking, it can be confused with being drawn to, the samsara because we're attached to it. We can be attached to suffering. We can actually, there's this psychology that we are actually enjoying our suffering so much that we keep repeating it, enjoying it in not that way that we actually enjoy it, but that we are just habituated to it.
Right. Almost identify with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So there's a difference. There's a difference, right?
Sure. Sure. Yeah, because I mean, again, we're not talking about
Yeah.
wallowing in our suffering or something, or becoming so enamored of our suffering that that's the only thing that we. I mean, that almost sounds, again, very similar to what Divya is talking about, where we sort of cave in on ourselves with that and only see that, and that is a form of self-cherishing. If that's all that we are doing is identifying with that suffering and seeing ourselves through that lens, and then being continually drawn to what makes us most miserable, well, that's, according to Buddhist terms, what we've already been doing since beginningless time. It's just a different way of doing it. It's kind of the same thing again of those people who are overly excited about their life and totally blissed out by all the beautiful, wonderful things that are of samsara, versus those people who are totally depressed and think everything is just suffering and miserable. They're both doing the same thing in essence. It's just two different techniques. One that's all elated and looking at all these things through that lens, and the other that's seeing it through the lens of it being utterly negative. So I think it's you're right. It's absolutely, that would be a misinterpretation of what we're doing here. Because the goal is always to transcend all of this, to go beyond all of this to the place where we have attained a state where we can then benefit others.
So the bodhisattva path is really it's going into samsara and being elated that, oh, I get to go into suffering now, but because for the benefit of others, it's a different
Exactly.
motivation. I think
Exactly.
that's
Rather than for, just my own whatever I'm satisfying by being, identifying with all that so closely. Absolutely. No, and I think that I certainly, I can point from my own experience where I think it was in college when I had a lot of, very dark thoughts and very things. Where I kind of got into that place of just wallowing in my own misery and almost being happy in my misery. If that sounds so bizarre, but and it's a trap again. It's not getting you to where you want to be, because it's not what we're talking about, as you pointed out so well, Adrienne, at the last thing you said. It's about doing that and dealing with one's suffering for the benefit of others, to transcend that to the state of Buddhahood, where then one can very skillfully help others. But you have to be in this stuff. The wonderful analogy that's sometimes used for renunciation, but I think it's very appropriate for the bodhicitta, is the lotus, right? The lotus grows in like the muddiest part of the pond, the uckiest part, the part that you wouldn't want to swim in at all because it's just gross and disgusting. But it needs that kind of gunk to flower, to kind of go up above it, transcend it, and flower unsullied by the mud. But if it doesn't have the mud, it can't grow. I think I may have told you this before, but I was so jealous when I saw that published book by Thich Nhat Hanh. The title was No Mud, No Lotus. I think it's such a perfect title for what we're talking about here in terms of mind training. You don't get to develop the lotus, you don't get to enlightenment without the mud. The mud is samsara and all the crazy stuff we have to deal with that you have to utilize. That's what Rinpoche emphasizes in his book. It's not just that you can, oh, this is a nice option. I could look at samsara this way and I could work with all this and become enlightened. He says you have to do this. That's why it's such a key part of the basic program and of so many of the teachings that Rinpoche does. Most of the teachings he's been doing from Nepal have been essentially Lojong teachings, saying, okay, folks, we're all dealing with this pandemic. We're all dealing with a lot of suffering, a lot of difficulty. This is it. This is the stuff you've been praying for. This is the way to get out of here and to, help others. But if you don't, look at it the right way, then it becomes, we're like the crows eating the poison and we just die. We just have our own miserable experience and we just keep going on from one miserable experience to the other. Very
well,
good question. Thank you for bringing that up. That helps to deepen our understanding, I think, by
just you talking about it this way helps me too. So thank you.
good. You're very welcome. Thanks, Adrienne. Anyone else? Anything that you want to share or questions? Okay, good. Thank you for your comments in the